guys, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to the Wandering Reader. Today I'm going to be doing a thriller recommendations video. I've been really in the mood for thrillers over the last couple of weeks, few weeks or so. I think I tend to like reading a thriller in the summer. So I thought I would recommend some that I've read in the past that I really enjoyed. If you feel the same way as me, that you're craving a thriller at this time of year. To me, a thriller is the perfect sort of in-between book, I suppose, or a book to read by the pool or on holiday, or when you're having some chilled downtime. Just because I can get into the plot so easily, and they're gripping and page turning. So if I've been reading things that are heavy, I like to kind of put a thriller in between them just to kind of break them up, and I absolutely love them. So like I said, I've got some recommendations here for you if, like me, you're craving them or you want some thriller recommendations for perhaps later in the year. I'm going to talk to you about 6 today. So let's jump into the first one. The first thriller that I want to talk about is No Time for Goodbye by Linwood Barclay, but really I want to talk to you about Linwood Barclay's books as a whole. I've got practically all of them on my shelf. I'm missing a couple and I hauled one last month. So, but I've been reading Linwood Barclay's books for years now. I first picked them up because they were a part of the Richard and Judy Summer Reads list at WH Smith. I'm sure some of you who live in the UK are aware of that book club that they have every year. And I picked up quite a few books from that book club in the past and really enjoyed them. And this was one of the first ones on their book club. So I picked it up for that reason originally and ended up really loving it, and therefore picking up every one of Linwood Barclay's books subsequently. So this one tells the story of a woman called Cynthia, and when she was a teenager, I think, she came home one day from having been out with her friends, and her family wasn't at home, and then they never came back. So they disappeared. She doesn't know where they've gone, and now we're reading from her perspective as an adult. She's married. I think she has a child. I think she has a daughter in this. And one day she receives a letter, and the letter makes reference to her past. And it sort of opens up the can of worms again about where her family went to and things like that. I absolutely loved this, and I love every one of Linwood Barclay's books. They're not the most well-written books in the world. They're not, the most literary books in the world or anything like that. But when I'm craving a real page turner, I know I'm going to enjoy whatever he puts out. And like I said, I've read most of what he's written, and I've got the sort of most of the ones that I haven't read yet on my shelf. So like I said, whenever I'm craving something, I will always turn to him. So and this is the first one that he wrote, I believe, or the first one that was published again in the UK, something like that anyway. I know that he's got another set of books that are being republished, which are a completely different set of books, a series, and I think they're being published later on this year or at the beginning of 2018, so I'm really interested in picking those ones up as well. But yeah, Linwood Barclay is a great author to go to if you like thrillers. The next book that I'm going to recommend is the first one in a trilogy, and I've read the other books in the trilogy too. They're downstairs, but I didn't want to lug them all the way up here. And that is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. This is the first book in the Millennium trilogy, and this is a thriller that centres around two main characters, and in fact those two main characters then follow through to the rest of the trilogy. I'm sure you're aware of what this trilogy is, but I still know of quite a few people who haven't read this, and they really should. It's so good. One of the main characters that this follows is Mikael Blomkvist, and this is sort of their Swedish thriller, but I can't do foreign accents, it's just terrible. So yeah, one of the main characters is Mikael Blomkvist, who is a journalist, and he works for, I think, a magazine that is sort of like an independently run magazine, a political magazine, and he is asked by the Vanga family to investigate a girl that went missing from their family about 20 years ago or so. So one day she was on the island that they lived on, and then she disappeared and they haven't heard from her since. And he meets during the course of this novel a woman called Lisbeth Salander. Yeah, and she is a very different character, shall we say, who helps him to try and work out where this girl went and what happened to her and things like that. And it's about so much more than that. When I first picked this particular book up, I found it quite hard to get into. There's a lot of sort of heavy political, or I thought so anyway, heavy political stuff at the beginning, where you're sort of learning about particular characters and particular situations, and I found it quite hard to get into. But as soon as I got into it, I absolutely flew through it, and read the other two books in the trilogy really quickly as well. Sadly, Stieg Larsson died, but he did have ideas for other novels, and since then there has been a novel published called The Girl in the Spider's Web. I can't remember the name of the man who's kind of writing as Stieg Larsson. I read perhaps the first 150 pages of that and DNF'd it in the end. I just couldn't get into it. It wasn't as page-turny for me. I felt there was a real difference between Stieg Larsson's writing and his writing. Like I said, I can't remember who it is. I'll put his name on the screen. Yeah, and he's got a second one coming out, which again is part of the series. I think it's later on this year. So I'm sort of umming and ahhing about whether I should pick that up again. If you've read that fourth book and you would recommend reading it, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments about your thoughts about it, whether it is worth me picking it back up again. But definitely the original trilogy I would highly recommend. The next thriller that I want to recommend is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, and I've said before on my channel that I've read all of Gillian Flynn's books and absolutely loved them. This is my favourite out of the ones that she has written so far. A lot of people like Gone Girl more. Gone Girl seems to be her most famous novel, but like I said, this is the one that I prefer out of the ones that I've read. And this is about a girl called Libby, or a woman called Libby, and when she was 7, her mum and her 2 sisters were murdered, and she gave evidence or testified against her brother. So her brother is now in prison for their murders. We're following her at the beginning of the book as an adult, and she's being contacted by this group who are sort of like, how should I describe them? They're like a fan group for criminals. Is that a way to describe them? Like they a group that get together and discuss criminal cases, and they like to get in witnesses and things like that. It's a bit of a hobby for them, and so they get in contact with her about her brother's crime and what happened to her mum and to her 2 sisters, and it opens up what happened that day for her all over again. Libby, the main character, is a great main character. She's so flawed in a lot of ways, but she's so interesting to read about at the same time. I was totally gripped by this, and I thought it was great from beginning to end. Some real twists and turns in here. Like I said, I'm a big fan of Gillian Flynn's writing, so this is a really good one to pick up. Perhaps if you've read Gone Girl but haven't considered reading her other novels, then I would definitely recommend Dark Places. The next one that I want to recommend is Disclaimer by Renee Knight. This tells the story of Catherine, who is a journalist, and one day she starts reading a novel. So the novel opens with her reading a novel, and when she starts reading this novel, she recognises some of the characters as being from her own life and the main character as being her. And so it obviously freaks her out, and she starts to think about why this book is likely about her, and the story kind of goes on from there. This is really quite dark, and there was a lot of sort of quiet sort of moments in it, but I loved it. It was brilliant, and again, didn't see the big twist coming, so I would really recommend this one. The next one that I want to recommend is Her by Harriet Lane. This tells the story of two women. One is called Emma and one is called Nina, and they meet one day. I can't remember whether they're neighbours or whether they just kind of bump into each other by chance. And slowly their lives start to intertwine. But what Emma doesn't realise is that she's met Nina before. And you know, as the story goes on, she realises sort of how she's met Nina and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's just, I'm not going to say more than that. I can't really say a lot about thrillers. I like going into them as blind as possible, because sometimes I find that if you read the blurb on the back of a thriller, it kind of gives away some of the early twists. And you know, they're early twists, so perhaps don't matter so much as the later ones. But yeah, I want to play the game of, I want to guess, you know, what's going on, and I can't always do that if I've read the blurb. So yeah, I'm not going to say anything more than that. But this was a good more sort of psychological thriller. Yeah, and it had a real kind of evil, sort of sinister edge to it, which I really liked. It was great. And the last thriller that I want to recommend is The Book of You by Claire Kendall. This I think I read last year, and this was probably one of my favourite thrillers that I read last year. This tells the story of Clarissa, and she's been having some problems with one of her colleagues called Rafe. He's been sort of a little bit stalky towards her. So she gets called up for jury service at the beginning of the book, and so it's a bit of a relief for her to get away from work and to get away from him, until he turns up and he's on the jury, I think. So I think the story goes from there, and this was just great. It was so dark, and there were some real kind of on edge moments in here. I loved Clarissa's character, but Rafe was a really great character as well to read about, and this was excellent. I would really recommend this as a great thriller to pick up. So there you go guys, they are the 6 thrillers that I would like to recommend today. I'd love to have a chat with you in the comments below. If you read any great thrillers that you would recommend, I'm always on the hunt for more great recommendations. I would say that thrillers are probably one of my most favourite genres to read, so I'd love to have a chat with you in the comments below about any that you've read that you would recommend, and whether you've read these and enjoyed them. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.